One of the most common passages Islamophobes bring to the table is Quran chapter 4 verse 34 that reads as, "But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them." Now Islamophobes read that passage and extract complete caricatures and misrepresentations of what the Quran is truly saying. They suggest this means that a man can be violent with his wife to the point of dealing black eyes or bruises to her. However, this act is clearly a contradiction to the very essence of what it means to be a caretaker to your wife. The Prophet ﷺ said, "How do you beat your woman? Like you would beat your animal and then try to sleep with her." So knowing this, we should gather our sources and seek an interpretation that makes the most sense in light of the Quran, the Sunnah, and classical scholarship. Before we do so, there seems to be a spectrum here where people assume this word in the Arabic for beat to mean two entirely unviable things. One is on the far right side, which assumes it's a harsh hitting of your wife, and the other one is on the far left, which assumes you can't even touch your wife with physical authority, but rather the term here for beat means to separate instead. I'll be getting to the refutation of each interpretation inshaAllah, and will provide clarity on the true interpretation bi'idhnillah. First, on the refutation that this beat is a harsh beating. The Quran itself shows us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His prophets have a disliking towards this action, as an example of Ayyub alayhi salam. In the Quran, Ayyub alayhi salam, in his sickness, made an oath that he would strike his wife if he came out of his ailment. And when he recovered from his ailment, he didn't want to pursue that oath, showing that it's not a noble act. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala agreed with him and gave him blades of grass to use when striking his wife instead, so that he could fulfill his oath while not being harsh with his wife. We also have the Prophet ﷺ himself saying that men who beat their wives are not the best among you. The Prophet ﷺ, when advising a woman about marriage, he disliked her to approach a man as he beats with a stick, showing it's a negative trait for a man to have. And finally, when quoting 434's application, he says this beating is a gentle beating that causes no harm. Ibn Abbas, may Allah be pleased with him, the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, said the light form of beating here is equivalent to the force of using a toothbrush with causing no bruise mark. All classical tafsirs I've seen for 434 make it very clear the beat here is a light form of physical discipline that cannot cause any harm. Now onto the other unviable view, which is on the opposite side of the spectrum, to say that daraba here would mean just to separate. This is an untenable view for multiple reasons. The first reason is that the man in this verse has already separated with his wife in bed. So what does it mean to separate from her more than that? It's not clear at all, and we have zero explanations from scholars on what this separation would entail had daraba meant so. Actually, this is a purely modern interpretation, because even a light form of physical discipline from a husband, or even a man having any sort of authority over a woman, is being questioned today by movements in the West. So rather than taking the Quran for what it says and how everyone understood it for almost 1400 years, there's a need now to twist the words of the Quran with its meanings to satisfy one's un-Islamic preconceived notions on how the dynamic should be between a man and a woman. And the most damning thing of all with his interpretation is this contradicts the Prophet ﷺ's interpretation himself. The Prophet ﷺ's interpretation of the Quran is revelation, as we know. So to say a contrary view to what the Prophet ﷺ had said is to undermine his view that comes directly from Allah Azza wa Jal. The Prophet ﷺ's interpretation, if we substitute daraba here with the term separate, would make no sense at all on separating gently or lightly from your wife. Clearly the Prophet ﷺ intended something physical here. Now finally getting to how we should understand this verse then. No one should look at the Quran and assume they can grasp a matter of jurisprudence without consulting scholars. For example, the Quran says to chop the hands off the thief, but how to do this is found outside of the Quran. There are conditions like the value of the item, whether the person was stealing out of necessity, and this is all laid out in the Sunnah and from the early scholars and the righteous companions who implemented this punishment. Now let's do the same thing now when we read Quran chapter 4 verse 34. We should bear in mind we can't determine what the beat would entail here without going outside of the Quran, so let's do that now. In 434, we have stages of how to deal with a disobedient wife. First, you advise her against her disobedience. Second, you separate from sleeping with her. If she still persists, then you implement the light physical discipline that is commonly translated as strike. Well, an example of how this would look is on the screen currently, and this is more effective than merely verbal admonition. It isn't to embarrass your wife, or to degrade her, or to make her feel any pain. It's to show how much you care for her and how serious her disobedience is that may lead to you guys separating via divorce. Physical means of conveyance is more effective and serious than mere verbal admonition or separating from one's bed. This is the correct understanding, inshallah, from the classic commentaries of the Quran, as well as the Prophet ﷺ's interpretation himself. I hope this video clarifies the misunderstandings associated with this verse. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Quick announcement: you can join for just $10 and gain access to my server, which includes notes, weekly lessons, and more. Your support helps fund thumbnails, editing, and other content. Jazakumullahu khair.